One of my earliest memories of boat ownership recalls a fine Saturday morning squandered between Egypt Point on the Solent's Island shore and Stone Point across on the mainland. Lymington had looked an easy sail from the Hamble, and I, being little more than a boy with no background in tidal planning and no navigation course completion certificate tucked securely in my back pocket, was bamboozled by the reality I faced. To and fro we went, beating into the stiffening sea breeze. At each tack, East Leap Buoy loomed up with its private bow wave, apparently charging to windward as the east-going spring floods swept past. The distance separating my 22-footer from the town quay was no less than it had been 2 hours earlier. After a further morale-busting board, I admitted that the tide had routed me and retreated into Cowes instead. The now friendly stream shot me downhill into the river and carried me onward to the Folly Inn. Here, in the lunchtime quiet of the public bar, I opened my heart to a man who was to become an early mentor. Ron lived aboard a decommissioned Yangtze River steam gunboat, whose lean hull and unmistakable sheer told of raw adventure in far-off places. He was a master of turning tides to his advantage. He and the gunboat used occasionally to disappear eastwards towards Belgium in the dark of the moon, returning a few days later, lower on their marks than when they'd left. No questions were asked, and no lies were told, but as he supped his pint that day, he set me straight about the basics. In the English Channel, the tide is king, he said. A weather forecast is useful, but ignore the tide and you're dead in the water. How right he was. In those days, the Folly could muster an up-to-date Reed's Almanac from behind the bottles. He thumbed through this to show me in about 5 minutes how to ensure a fair stream on simple passages. Then he slipped me the wink about 1 or 2 tricks of his trade. These included the little-known fact that on a big tide a vessel maintaining 8 knots through the water can steam from the Hamble River into the North Sea with the tide under her all the way. The secret is to sail on an east-going eddy running along the north shore of the East Solent before the main stream turns. Hit this, and you're home free. The hours and Brighton are soon astern. You whiz by Beachy to round Dungeness in time to catch the gravy train up to the Straits of Dover, and on past the Goodwins to heaven knows where, with the spring flood still barrelling up astern. It was years before I was able to take advantage of Ron's more sophisticated advice, but from that day on, tidal waters became a wonderland where a few minutes with the stream atlas spelt out a passport to improbable distances run over many a 6-hour period. It also opened the door to destinations I hadn't previously considered. A case in point for sailors round the Isle of Wight is Bembridge Harbour, where a glance at the chart is plenty to put off the tidally innocent. The entrance channel more or less dries out, and there are other places to go, so why expose yourself gratuitously what might look like danger? Armed with my newfound education, however, the place took on a different mien. Today it's even better. There's a grand little marina in deep water, privately run by people who are proud of their facility. They'll buy in the Sunday papers for you, deliver fresh bread, and even ferry you across to the extraordinary village in their mini landing craft if the tide serves. It's all very jolly, but the best thing is that arriving or leaving, the tide is always on your side, so long as you aren't coming from east of Selsey Bill. Because of the drying channel, it's important to turn up in the offing with plenty of rise, but thanks to a merciful Almighty, the harbour lies at the extreme eastern end of the known world for Solent sailors or adventurers from Chichester. From anywhere west of here, the flood carries you to Bembridge, and the ebb will whisk you home again. The rising tide you've come on supplies plenty of water to float you in and to see you out when you're ready. If you show up early, a call to the marina or a swift internet search reveals the real-time depth at the shallowest parts of the channel via an electronic tide gauge. Those who don't trust electronics or can't be bothered to stroll up to the office for chapter and verse when it's time to leave can check out the monster old-fashioned gauge on the visitor's berth. One way and another, it's hard to go wrong. When it comes to tidal predictions, not much has changed over the decades since Ron's steam gunboat ran to Dover under the stars. Weather's the same too. Fronts are still fronts, although a few new arrivals on the scene, such as bombs and the modern meaning of troughs, have come along to challenge complacency. Forecasting, however, has undergone a revolution. I try to keep in step, and my onboard computer is stuffed with programs for predicting the inevitable, but every now and again I find myself lagging behind. Oddly enough, the last time this happened was in Bembridge, a couple of years back. It was Sunday morning. Overnight, a maniac cold front had thundered through. Down on the docks we were punch-drunk from hail battering on our hatches in the small hours. We now lay under a highly unstable airstream, with the Met man promising squalls and the lady on the next yacht telling me she could see them coming on her internet radar. This showed the immediate past and encouraged a spot of creative extrapolation to give a homemade short-range forecast. It all sounded like a tall story to me. We hadn't had a gust for an hour or more. The sky to windward was clear, and except for the fact that my barometer was going up like a lift in Canary Wharf, you'd have been forgiven for thinking it was all over by the shouting. "What's next, then?" I asked her, more out of politeness than curiosity. "There's a whopper coming in," she replied, and toddled off to double up her springs. My plan was to leave as soon as I could squeeze out, and I was watching the big gauge with interest. It hit 2.6 metres. Half a metre clearance for the Queen, just as the neighbour popped her head up the hatch to promise the alleged squall in 30 minutes. Still no sign of any weather. Just a nice sunny force 6 on the beam. I had to cross the bar into my home port of Bewley at the end of the passage. If I hung around here, depths might well be shoaling by the time I arrived. I needed all the tide I could get, so I cast caution to the breeze, and away I went. We were off Seaview when the world went mad. Up to windward, out of nothing, the shore disappeared in a total whiteout. First the rain came, so solid it wouldn't have shamed a fire hose. Then the wind. I hadn't seen anything like that in decades. The dial appeared to have given up in disgust, but I know it was over 50 knots solid, because when I tried to walk out on the deck I couldn't stand up. We'd wrestled the main offer when we saw it coming, and I rolled away all but a fag end of jib, under which we reached at improbable speed in zero visibility on a safe compass heading I'd noted just before the rain and horizontal spray shut out all hope of seeing anything beyond the pulpit. 20 minutes later, it was all over, with no damage except to our self-esteem. Doubtless the lady with the computer was still snug in her berth, deciding whether to slip her lines or have another cup of tea. We'd won the chess game with the tide, but when it came to meteorology, technology had triumphed over intuition. Occasionally, even high-water Portsmouth has to take second place.